hadith,
Yes.
because we have the miraculous, living miracle, the Kur'an, saved 1400 years, that has been unchanged, miracle after miracle. You want science, is in there. Your purpose of life is in there. Where you're going when you die, it's in there. But now there's another part, there's some confusion for some Muslims, and also some people who are coming to Islam. They want to know the second miracle that has come that goes hand in hand with the Qur'an is this hadith. Talk to us a little bit about the hadith.
Okay, in terms of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, I think when we get into this discussion, two things have to be discussed. Number one is the authority of the Sunnah and its relationship to the Qur'an. So I guess we'll start with that first.
Yes.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, throughout the Qur'an, He says, وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهُ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولِ, and in other ayat He says, وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهُ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولِ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ, that obey Allah and obey the Messenger and those in authority amongst you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this ayah in Surah Nisa, which is, I believe is Surah number 4, ayah number 59, He says, obey Allah and obey the Messenger and those in authority amongst you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over here is saying, unconditionally you have to obey Allah, and unconditionally you have to obey the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then conditionally, this is actually a linguistic benefit of the ayah, then conditionally you have to obey those in authority amongst you. He says, أَطِيعُوا اللَّهُ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولِ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ. He didn't mention وَأَطِيعُوا أُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ in this ayah. And the point of this is that you have to obey the first two unconditionally, and the third is conditionally based upon the Sharia.
Yes.
So in order for this commandment to be relevant at all times, and we know that the Qur'an is a message for all times, this necessitates that the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ would have to be preserved in one way or another. But let's put that on the side for one point. Ibn Abbas, who was one of the greatest scholars of tafsir, or exegesis as we call in English, he narrated that when the Prophet ﷺ was alive, this is what it meant to obey the Prophet ﷺ. And after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, it meant that we would follow his sunnah. So this is point number one. In terms of authority, the Qur'an is at the same level as the sunnah, and the sunnah is at the same level as the Qur'an. And the texts of this are many. Point number two in this, in terms of the relationship of the Qur'an to the hadith, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in another ayah in Surah An-Nahl that indeed we have revealed unto you a dhikr, so that you may explain to mankind that which was revealed to them. So here Allah is talking about a different revelation that was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so that he may explain a previous revelation. So the initial revelation is the Qur'an, and the second revelation that was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the Sunnah itself. And point number three, this is further emphasized in an ayah in Surah An-Najm, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيُ يُوحَىٰ, that he does not speak of his own desire, of his own accord, but rather he speaks that which is revelation. So all of these ayat put together with the other various ayat, they indicate and prove that the Qur'an comes along with the Sunnah. And the Sunnah, in fact, is an explanation for the Qur'an. And this is why you'll see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks in various generalities and ambiguities in the Qur'an. And the Sunnah there comes to explain it. And this is one of the easiest arguments against those people that deny the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How do you learn to pray? How do you know that you have to pray Fajr, Dhuhr, Maghrib and Isha? All of these things are not mentioned in the Qur'an.
You can't do it without the hadith.
Exactly, you need the Sunnah, we're dependent upon it. So in terms of authority, I think the debate is pretty much of no value. Where the debate actually starts to occur is in terms of the preservation of the Sunnah and its validity until our times today. This is where you can get a bit technical, and if you'll allow me, I'd like to explain that as well.
Yeah, if you don't mind, can you go into that now for someone who says, okay, I know that the Qur'an is preserved, but now how do I know that man hasn't had his share of putting in his own words into these hadith?
Excellent. Jazakallah khair. So now we mentioned in our point number 2 that Allah revealed the Qur'an, He revealed the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in order to explain the Qur'an. So if the explanation is needed almost as much as the Qur'an, if not more, then how does it make sense logically that only the origin would be preserved but not its explanation? Because what good is that origin without its explanation? So from a logical point of view, we understand that the Sunnah needed to be preserved. But now let's look at some of the texts pertaining to that as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we will preserve a dhikr, right?
Yes.
We revealed the dhikr and we shall preserve it. So this is a promise from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that anything that takes the title of a dhikr or the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it shall be preserved without a doubt. So that is point number one. Point number two, if you look in terms of the chronology of the preservation of the sunnah, you will see that the Prophet ﷺ had scribes for the sunnah just as he had scribes for the Qur'an.
So these two didn't mix now. One was assigned for the writing of the Qur'an and the others were prescribed for writing of the
sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is authentically established, and you'll see that even in one of the narrations of Sahih al-Bukhari, we all know that the most famous companion for narrating hadith, when you think of the most famous companion, who do you think of?
Abu Hurairah.
Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala. He narrated the most hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He has another narration in Sahih al-Bukhari which says that there's no companion that knew more hadith than me except for Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. And he said, why is that? He said, because he used to write down a hadith during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is indication number one. Indication number two, Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he had a scroll from the Prophet ﷺ that he had written down himself, that he had saved in a treasure chest, which is, had saved in a chest, which is mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari as well. Point number three is when we study the chapter of zakat, we know that we derive the rulings from the Qur'an and the Sunnah. The primary source for the Sunnah in terms of deriving rulings of zakat is a letter that Umar ibn al-Khattab wrote to Anas radiallahu ta'ala, who was a governor in another land. So Umar writes to Anas and he says that this is what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught me in terms of the dividing of the zakat and how much zakat to take, and I advise you with the exact same thing. And he had it written down and sent to Anas. So we can see that during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, ahadith were actually being written down, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had no problem with this. A lot of people will come up with a point over here and they say we have an authentic hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says that I forbid you from writing down a hadith. They'll take this general term and they say this proves that he did not want the hadith to be written down. But we say to this that this has to be taken in its proper context. And Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, one of the great scholars of hadith who came in the 8th century, he said that one of two things takes place over here. Either this hadith was abrogated, meaning that this is in the advocacy of Islam and it was later on abrogated, because obviously we know the companions, they wouldn't disobey the Prophet ﷺ, thus they would have destroyed their scrolls. Point number two, and this actually makes more sense, is that this ruling was particular for those scribes who were writing down the Qur'an. The Prophet ﷺ did not want them to record hadith so that it wouldn't be mixed with the Qur'an and one would be confused or construed with the other. So this is a refutation to that point. So this is in terms of the companions writing down a hadith. And you will notice that the Prophet ﷺ actually took great precaution in the companions narrating hadith of the Prophet ﷺ as well. Just to mention three brief points on this issue. The Prophet ﷺ says in one hadith, may Allah brighten the face of a man who narrates a hadith from us just as he heard it. So here's a form of encouragement. Point number two, the Prophet ﷺ said that let none of you withhold knowledge if he is asked about anything, and if he were to do so, then he would be branded from the hellfire. So point number one is to learn the hadith, memorize it, and narrate it just as you heard it. Point number two is that if you're asked about the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and you don't make it clear to the people, then know that you will be branded from the hellfire. And then point number three, he further emphasized this. He said that let whoever lies upon me intentionally prepare his seat in the hellfire. So he psychologically prepared the companions of the Prophet ﷺ to memorize the hadith just as he learnt them, and convey them diligently, and to beware of fabricating anything. And this is why they're called the most trustworthy of nations. So this is just at the level of the companions, and I'm sure you want to include something over here.
What is the meticulous nature of the collection of the hadith, knowing, can you describe the biography of the person, and what would a person have to fill as far as qualities for that hadith to be accepted, and how many people does it line up from A, B, to C to the last and final message of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? Okay,
in terms of a hadith to be authentic, there are 5 conditions that need to be met. Condition number 1 is what they call ittisal sanad, that it has to be a connected chain of narration from the Prophet ﷺ to the person who is compiling it.
So we got to know who's in between.
You have to know everyone who's in between, and those people, they actually have characteristics. Condition number 2 is what they call tamud dabt. Tamud dabt means they have to have absolute perfect precision in narrating the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Point number 3 is adalatul ruwat, that they have to be trustworthy people. That not only do their memories have to be on point, but they have to be people who are away from sin and away from innovation.
Yeah.
Point number 4 is adam al-shudud, or a lack of contradiction or opposition between the narrations amongst themselves. And then the 5th condition is adamu illatin qadiha, or a lack or absence of a what they would call a sickness or a disease in the hadith, or a weakness in the hadith that would cause it to be weak. To give you an example of this, Imam Muslim rahimahullah, he tries to make a point in his Sahih about a particular hadith. And this is the well-known hadith, the 7 people who will be under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day that there is no shade except His shade. All of the narrations of this hadith, they say that a man gave charity so secretly that the left hand will not know what the right hand gave. But Imam Muslim, if he wanted to prove a point in his Sahih, he goes on with the narration that the left hand will give that which the right hand will not know. So it's the exact opposite. So this type of deficiency, it is even recorded along with Sahih collections just to prove a point that this is an inauthentic narration. So all of these things meticulously put together, you're studying a connected chain of people where you know their names, their teachers' names, their fathers' names, and everyone that they study with. And you know the level of precision of their memory, and you know how trustworthy they were in terms of their religion. An average person in our times would not be allowed to narrate hadith due to various reasons. From them is that our memories are nothing close to what the memories of the people of the past were. And 2, our dedication to the religion is nothing like theirs as well. Just to give one example, we have the likes of Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah, who is narrated to have said about himself that when he wanted to memorize a book that had 2 pages, he'd have to cover one side because it would interfere with his mind when he would read the other side.
Wow.
So he would read a page once and he'd have to cover the other side so it wouldn't interfere in his mind. And he'd be able to memorize a page like that. And similar stories have been narrated about Imam Shafi'i and other great Imams as well. And in terms of their piety, it's narrated that Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah, in the month of Ramadan, he would finish the Qur'an every 3 nights at nighttime in Salah. And then during the day, he would finish the Qur'an once in terms of sitting and reciting the Qur'an. So this is a totally different level of piety and a totally different level of preservation and memorization of the text that we're talking about. So without a doubt, when you apply these very constraining rules to hadith, without a doubt, you'd have to have, even this science of themselves would have to be a form of revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order for it to be so perfect.